Today we're out shooting a wintry portrait. We've got the hats, the coats, the scarves, and even the snow. A fake snow machine like this sprays out a stream of soapy flakes that float gently to the ground, just like the real thing. You can hire machines like this from most entertainment suppliers, and they won't break the bank either. This one was £25 for the day and came filled up and ready to use. Real or fake, snow adds a wonderful wintry atmosphere to your portraits. Falling snowflakes create a great sense of depth, with softly blurred snow in the foreground and background. On this unseasonably warm autumn day, we looked for a spot in the shade of a tree to avoid shooting in direct sunlight for softer, more flattering light. We positioned Erin here with the red leaves behind her for a splash of Christmassy colour in the background. A wintry portrait is a great opportunity to get out hats, coats, scarves, and any other winter attire. Hats and hoods provide a natural frame for the face, and furry textures can contrast well with smooth skin. The wind takes the flakes from the snow machine very quickly, so we found it worked best to start off upwind of the subject so that the snow drifts across them. Ideally, we want a blizzard that gently drifts both in front of and behind our subject. The fake snow is almost like bubble bath, and any larger blobs can ruin the effect if they settle on the subject. But it's surprising how real they look in an image, especially if we keep the depth of field very shallow so that they come out blurred. Whether faking a freezing day like this or shooting any kind of portrait outdoors, there are a few important decisions to make about your kit and camera settings. Your choice of lens will have a big effect on the look of your portrait. The Canon 135mm f2 lens I've got here has a good focal length for portraits. That's because longer focal lengths have a compressing effect that makes a person's body and facial features look properly proportioned. By contrast, a wider focal length can leave the head looking larger than the body, or for close-ups, the nose looking larger than the subject might like. So use long focal lengths for portraits, and if you're shooting them with a zoom, try to stick to the longer end and if necessary take a few steps back and zoom in. Of course, with a prime lens like this, I'm restricted to a single focal length, but the lack of flexibility is a price worth paying for the image sharpness and wide max apertures you get with a good quality prime. This lens has a max aperture of f2, which means we can get a very shallow depth of field and blur out the background. Compare this to f5.6, which is the usual max aperture that you'd find at the long end of a typical standard kit zoom, and you can see the difference the wider aperture makes. At f2 the background is a beautiful silky blur, while at f5.6 there's just enough detail in the background to cause a distraction. However, it can be easy to fall into the trap of always shooting wide open, but the max aperture isn't always the best choice. It depends what you want to keep sharp. We need to be careful with close-ups, as the closer the subject, the narrower the plane of focus. Here at f2 the plane of focus is so narrow that one of the eyes is soft. This might be what you want, but if you need to keep both eyes sharp, better to stop down to f5.6 or f8. When shooting with a shallow depth of field, focusing becomes more critical. The most precise way to focus is by moving the focus point around the grid until it sits over the subject's closest eye. I also like to use the back button to trigger the autofocus and disable the shutter button, as I find it easier to keep the act of focusing and the act of taking the picture separate from one another. With the snow here moving in front of the subject, there's also a danger that the autofocus may snap onto it. We can reduce the risk of this by lowering the tracking speed of the autofocus so that it ignores subjects that come between the camera and the subject. For outdoor portraits in varying light, I like to shoot in manual mode with auto ISO, so I can choose whichever shutter speed and aperture I like, while the ISO adapts to the lighting conditions. Of course, you can use lower shutter speeds for creative effects if you like. I wanted to try and blur some of the moving flakes of snow, so I fixed the camera to a tripod, took the shutter speed down to 1/30th of a second, and asked the subject to stay as still as possible. This resulted in slight motion blur over the drifting snowflakes that adds to the mood of the shot. So there we have it. That's a few things to think about when shooting a winter portrait. Give it a go and bring on the snow.